Today, I'll be talking about the digits of the creator economy. So you're probably familiar with the creator economy, but you might be wondering, what the hell do you mean by digits? Now, I've worked in marketing for a long time. I also work in technology, and we're surrounded by data. There's data coming at us every single day, and it's really hard to tell what matters and what doesn't. But every so often, there is a data point that does tell you something really insightful about the future. And often, those data points, because we're so flooded, 99% of people ignore, but the 1% that pays attention to the right data points does have an edge. They have an edge to be a better creator, to be a better entrepreneur, to spot the next industry. And what I've tried to do, it's a little unconventional for a keynote-esque talk like this, but is to curate 10 digits, so that's what I've done, of things that I noticed over the last maybe year or so that I think relate to the creator economy and hopefully give you some sort of edge. Because I assume people here want that and also work in the creator industry. Now I always leave a why the hell should I listen to you slide in here that I'll only spend 30 seconds on, but I recognize I often look 16 years old or so, and people are like, who is this girl? Why is she talking about the creator economy? Why should I listen to her? Now, I guess my best answer here is that I am a creator, and you can see a bunch of other terms up there that I've crossed out because I've done a lot. I've been a podcaster, I wrote a book, I built HubSpot's creator program, I taught myself to code many years ago and built a bunch of things on Product Hunt and launched them. I have grown my Twitter. I recently joined A16Z as their new podcast host. So I've done a lot of stuff. I've failed at a lot of stuff, but I've really crammed a lot of things in since I started creating in 2018. So all those things on the right-hand side are full projects that I've done, launched, sold, etc. So hopefully that's enough to help convince you that I know a little bit about the creator economy. And now because I'm doing this new role, I do have to leave this slide in here, which is that this does not represent the views of my employer, and they are solely my views. And hopefully this should be obvious, but none of this is investment advice. Okay, so the first question that I want to leave with this room, and I don't know, I wasn't expecting this big room, so I thought we would have a smaller space, but I want to ask people this very simple question of what is a creator? Does anyone have any Yeah, I can see someone back there.
It's when you put out content to share with the world.
All right, great. Anyone else have? There's no right or wrong answers here, if that helps.
You make things.
You make things?
We are all creators.
All right, so as you can tell, well, one, if I want you to take anything away, is that yes, the term creator is really broad. The way someone uses it is likely not the same way that someone else will use it. If you ask your neighbor right now, they'll probably have a different definition than you. And what I think all three touched on is that it's really, really broad. It's really broad. It's not this like concise thing that many people treat it like. And I also want to share my own definition for the purpose of this presentation, but before I do that, I want to share that this is also not new. I feel like there's a lot of hype around creators, which is exciting because we have new tools and a lot of new things going on. The terms are new, but the things that we're doing really aren't. And a couple examples are these other terms that we're very familiar with as well. So if you've heard the term celebrity, you don't hear it as much anymore because these things go through cycles. And so in 2006, that was when the term celebrity hit its peak. And since then, it's kind of been dwindling. In 2016, before that, the term influencer didn't exist. It appeared, now it's kind of plateaued. And around a year ago, people started using this term creator economy. It's a cool term, it sounds pretty neat. It sounds exciting, but it's also not new. It's really not new. There are some new facets about what's going on. But it's not new, and you can see there are slight differences between how people view these terms. So for example, celebrity tends to be a little more exclusive sounding. Maybe influencer sounds a little more negative, sounds like you might be shilling some stuff. And then creator, people seem to associate more with what you're creating. So for example, you're a writer, you're a producer, you're an author, but it's all the same thing. You're putting stuff out there and really influencing people as you're doing that. And to kind of get the wheels spinning even more, and this will relate to the 10 digits, but I think as I started to ask myself certain questions about what a creator is, I started to get more lost than less. So I'll just ask a couple questions. No one needs to answer, but answer to yourself so you can get an understanding of what you think a creator is or isn't. So the first question is, if someone creates something online, or let's say not even online, if they just create something one day, but they have zero audience, no one sees that, kind of like the, if a tree falls in the forest, does anyone know, or does it actually happen? Is that person a creator? If you create something but you have no audience, are you a creator?
Yes.
Okay, well, some people agree. If you produce something you never monetize, so let's say you have an audience, but you make $0 for years and years and years, are you still a creator?
Yes.
Okay, and if someone has a huge team behind them, right? Let's say they have 50 people helping them create their content. Are they a business or are they a creator? Okay, there you go. So I agree with most of the sentiment within this room, but you can tell that the term creator is almost like human. Like, you're a human if you go and you wake up and you make your breakfast, you're creating something. If you go outside and you tell someone this really funny story, you're influencing them. They now think you're funny. Maybe they'll want to hang out with you in the future. And so really the idea of a creator, and I'm sharing this because I think it's equally exciting but also used in certain contexts that aren't very helpful, right? Because all of us in this room are creators, but so are the people working at the grocery store, so are the people that you see, on your daily commute. And so for the purpose of this conversation, I wanted to clarify what creator means in this context. And for me, it's someone leveraging their unique talents to build an audience online. Now, of course, you're going to say, well, there's creators who don't do that, and that doesn't fit within your definition. But when I'm talking about the 10 digits that I'm going to be sharing today, it really relates to this definition of creator. And I would also encourage you all to write down your own definition of creator, because you probably use it in your everyday life, and it's probably not human, right? It's not the equivalent of that broad definition. Now, this might sound negative, but there are a lot of reasons to be excited, right? So a lot of the things that I'm going to talk about today relate to 6 different things that have changed, right? So the things that a celebrity had in 1999 are not the same things that you have in 2022. So we have better tooling. That means better distribution, better analytics, better ability to monetize. You also have better feedback loops. Imagine if you were a rapper in the year 2000. Your only way to get in front of people, maybe not the only way, but the way most people had to accomplish reaching a large audience was to sit in their basement, work away for a year, hope they were creating something wonderful. Hopefully they had access to a label, and then they'd go and they'd share it, and they'd hope that it would hit, right? That it would land. Today, you can come up with an idea. You literally, right now during my talk, you can hear something, you can think of something, you can tweet it, and you can have a feedback loop that exists immediately. So that has also changed, and that's also getting quicker too. It's permissionless. It means anyone can show up. You don't need label access. You can literally show up, sign up for a Twitter account, sign up for a Pinterest account, sign up as a musician on Spotify. You can do that permissionlessly. There's also more demand. A lot of people talk about supply across the creator ecosystem. They go, oh my gosh, there's so many creators. How could I ever participate? Well, if you look at all the content being created, people are consuming that content. You can look up all the data around, how many Google searches happen every minute, how many tweets are read every minute, things like that. They indicate supply, but they also indicate demand, which is also very exciting, that so many people want to create, but also consume content, and that's growing as we speak. There's also an increasing number of distribution channels, right? So if I use the example from 20 years ago, well, if you wanted to reach people, you better be a host at a top radio station, you better have access to one of the top newspapers, or something like that, because they were the ones with distribution. Today, you can go on Reddit, you can go on Facebook, you can YouTube. There's endless channels that you can distribute with, but they're also way more specific. You can reach people on very, very niche subreddits that you just absolutely could not reach in the past. So that's also exciting. And then, of course, now anyone can participate, not just permissionlessly, but literally anyone in any country, as long as they have an internet connection. And that's also very exciting, because remember, there's a flip side to everything. That means you can also access all of those people. So that's a really brief overview before we get into the digits. And again, there's going to be 10 of them. So the first one is really Creator Economics 101. And the first data point is in a 2021 study of leaked Twitch data. They did not want to share this data. Only 5% of streamers made over $1,000 in that year. That is not per week, per month, that's per year. There's most people, a strong, strong majority, that did not make anywhere close to a living wage. And this is not specific to Twitch. And this is probably the most negative digit that you'll hear through this presentation. It's not meant to be negative, but it's meant to be realistic, okay? A lot of these platforms, it's their job to say, hey, we can all do this. Everyone can become a creator, because it is permissionless, right? But you can see data from, we have Twitch on here in the top left, Patreon, OnlyFans and Spotify. And now some of these platforms don't release this data. This is just data that's made its way out there. But you can see these graphs may all look different, but they tell the same story. And that story is that very few creators make the lion's share of the money in the creative industry. This may not be surprising, but it should be important for you to know if you are a creator, right? You need to know what game you're playing and who else is playing it in order to win. And this is not just specific to these tech platforms. You can see up in the upper right, there's a statistic from Manga, if you're familiar with these kind of like comics in Asia. Well, the same thing happens there, where 95 people, that's probably around the number of people in this room, account for 64% of the sales in that industry. So this is true everywhere, and it shouldn't be surprising either, because, well, actually I get to because in a second, but what I want to double down on before I get there is this idea of a Gini coefficient. If you're familiar with that, it's basically an approximation where you can get a sense of the wealth distribution within a certain subset of people, right? So a lot of people will look at it on a country basis or something like that. Well, if you have perfect equality when it comes to income distribution, you get a very straight line, as you can see on the upper left. And you can see that the more unequal it gets, you get more of that L shape. And over on the right, you can see the equivalent distribution for all types of things. So fiction books, video games, newspapers, musicians, they all look pretty L-shaped to me. There's some that are a little better than others, but the idea here is that, again, very few creators win a majority of the pie. And so this isn't meant to be this isn't meant to be necessarily a bad thing or a value judgment on this system, but it is, again, something that you need to know if you're going to participate. And I'm curious to know, before I move on to explain how I think this might progress, if anyone else in the room has an opinion. Do you think this is where we are in 2022, or do you think that this is temporary and that the creator middle class, as people label it, will grow and inevitably will be sizable in the future? Does anyone have any opinions there? Yep.
I think that the mass audience will cease to exist except for all but the smallest percentage. So it's going to be getting comfortable with smaller and smaller pieces of pie, and you can still have meaningful success in those spaces.
Great. Any other thoughts? Yeah, so before I guess I have two more, but yeah, it sounds like you think that people or creators will have to, this idea of being able to reach everyone or mass distribution will disappear, and people will have to become increasingly comfortable with earning small pieces of the pie, but that doesn't necessarily mean that's not still like a significant chunk. Is that accurate? Yeah, back there, I think.
I think that was going to stay exactly the same, which is the amount of money is going to, or the number of people is going to slowly increase and really move it. But that's the definition of human nature, not like some capitalist evil plan.
Yes, so again, not placing a value judgment on this, but more so just illuminating where we're at. And I think, Sarah, you had your hand up?
I don't think it's going to change either, but I think there's more and more companies that are making it easy to sell digital products. So maybe if you can't make money from YouTube or from one of these other paid platforms, maybe you can make money trying to sell something, even if you only have like 10,000 followers.
Yeah. I'll take one more, yeah.
I'd be curious to see data on how long people have been at it, because there's a lot of people at this conference that we started like 10 years ago.
Yes.
And most of us have figured out how to make some money, I would hope, right, after that amount of time. But a lot of people just start and they do 5 podcasts and that's it. So that's just the interesting piece of the equation of how long people have been with it.
Definitely. That's something that I'll talk about later as well. But I mean, I think I agree with certain sentiment in this room, and I'm not a future reader, so I don't know for sure, but I think one point that I think is important for people to understand is that democratization of access, which is improving, right, to your access to participate in this ecosystem, does not equal democratization of results. And in fact, because things are more democratized, you tend to see more exponential results. And that's why we've seen those L-shaped Gini coefficients within the creator space. And it's for a very simple reason that probably everyone's accustomed to, but maybe hasn't digested, which is just if everyone can reach anyone. So if all of you can reach anyone around the world has access to everyone. But that doesn't mean that they're going to be chopping up their time and saying, okay, I'm going to allocate 10% here, 5% here, 1%. No, they're going to participate with the most high quality, their favorite form of content. So you can see, I don't know if, yeah, the mouse is here. So this is what we see if we're creators. We're like, we can reach everyone and we're all participating, we've got this big pie. This is what every individual consumer sees. They see a bunch of options and they're gonna choose the best one. And each individual consumer chooses the best option, and so that's why the best stuff rises to the top, right? And so I do think that there are certain dynamics where, yes, you've heard of 1,000 true fans, maybe that'll become 100 true fans. Maybe you can monetize your smaller audience more effectively. Maybe you can have access to certain data that allows you to become better over time. But still, I think this dynamic of the best winning will not change due to the access that we have, right? It's a double-edged sword, but I think that's important. So if you really digest that, if you understand that you have to be one of the best, that's really what the rest of, or most of this presentation will go over. How do you actually become the best, right? What are the things that we can learn? Because you can't be mediocre anymore. And so this might seem like a weird digit, but the data point is that Hello Kitty, yes, that cat that you've probably heard of, has generated $88 billion in merch sales from 50,000 products across over 100 countries. And you might wonder, why are we talking about Hello Kitty? Well, I want to talk about something that I call the media on-ramp and the importance of IP, which I think not enough creators care about. Okay, so you might wonder, why are we talking about Hello Kitty? Well, what are you doing when you're a creator? You're creating things that people buy into. You're developing influence so that at some later point you can monetize it, right? It might be through a course, it might be through selling your own content, it might be through people believing in you so you can get a speaking gig. Well, the same thing is true with Hello Kitty or other franchises. They create content out there that people buy into. And for some odd reason, people have bought into Hello Kitty to the extent that they love Hello Kitty. And they love it so much that they've placed this brand on jets, electric guitars, musical instruments, anything. As I mentioned, 50,000 products around the world that people have bought. And it's not because that lunchbox with Hello Kitty on it is better than the other lunchbox. It's because they've bought into Hello Kitty, right? And there's a lesson there, which is the power of content is not often, it sometimes is, but often not to sell the content. It's to develop a narrative to which you can sell on top of. Okay, so following along this thread, hopefully you can see some of this. I know some of it might be tiny, but the left-hand side is a bunch of franchises that you recognize. Hello Kitty's included there, but so is Star Wars, so is Pokemon. A lot of these franchises have built media, right? You've gone and seen the films, and you might think that that media is what has generated the business outcome for those particular franchises. That's not true. You can't see all the little slivers, but there are things like, the box office, book sales, but the big yellow one is merch, because people love stuff. And I'm not saying you should go and sell a bunch of merch, but the core lesson here is that the content itself is a conduit to sell something else. Doesn't mean you can't sell content, but the most successful people have utilized content to get to some other outcome. And over here on the right, I don't think you can see any of this. This is from the book I wrote about content, but basically the key takeaway is a lot of people who are creators, especially content creators, think that there's two options. It's either create content and then sell a bunch of ads on top of that content, or sell the content itself. I would actually say the first is often better than the second, but both are not the full realm of options out there. And so you can see here, you can sell the content, you can get donations, you can drive affiliates, you can have different types of ads, but the most effective way to generate true income from your content is to create products or services that are the back end to your content, right? And the reason that you don't see a lot of creators do that is because it's hard. It's really hard to create, a fully fledged product instead of just driving affiliate income somewhere else. But that is, as you can see from some of these massive franchises, the content is a conduit to selling something else. And tied to that, I think, if we talk about the example where a lot of people end up gating their content or selling their content directly. Now, don't take anything I say with absolutism. There are obviously examples where people have successfully sold their content, and that's been a really great outcome for them. But I often see creators jump to selling their content, and that often is not a great play, because it does give you immediate gains, but it really shoots yourself in the foot because you've used your best asset, which is this engine of awareness that other people engage with, share, tell other people about, and you've put it behind a paywall. You've basically stopped all of your viral potential by sucking the money out immediately by charging for that content and instead of letting it run for you. Now, Joe Rogan is a great example. We're obviously would love to be Joe Rogan and have the deal that he got with Spotify. So he cashed in. But you can see even Joe Rogan, who has so much influence at the time, his sale to Spotify was in effect gating his content to a degree. Not if you had Spotify, but if you didn't, you're not listening to Joe Rogan anymore. And of course, some of those people converted, but this is true across the board, where people, when they take their content, they don't realize its power to sell for something else, and instead they sell it. And there are other examples, like the Obamas left Spotify because they wanted wider distribution. And there's tons of successful creators that have understood this. Packy McCormick is one. He writes on Substack, but his content is not gated. And instead, how he makes his money is through, yes, brand ad deals, which he makes a lot from, but also he now invests in companies, right? So that's his conduit. That's his relation between the content and the money that he's making. Barstool Sports, hopefully people recognize in this room, it's a huge media brand. Well, they have tons of podcasts. One of them is Spittin' Chicklets. I've never listened to it. I think it's a hockey podcast. But instead of monetizing the podcast, they've created a vodka brand that now does over 100 million, and I think that number is outdated. So one key takeaway is if you're creating content, yeah, the content might be the product, but it doesn't have to be, and it often shouldn't be. The final thing that I won't spend much time on here is if you are thinking of gating your content, well, ask yourself, I think Sam said this yesterday, what value are you driving? Is there actually some substantial value that you're putting behind a paywall that's different to the content that would not be behind a paywall? And these are really the core reasons I've thought of, and I've kind of studied a lot of gated products as to why people would buy gated content versus not. And so it might be more actionable or more specific information. Might also be more timely. That's why some people are willing to pay for news, but often not. If they want to win back their time, so if it really helps them, instead of having to research for 20 hours themselves, if it really helps them cut that down to 20 minutes, well, people will pay for that. There's also people who will fund specific types of journalism, like if they're anti-establishment or anti-clickbait, they might pay for that. But again, these are minorities, they truly are. And sometimes if they want to fund a particular organization or individual, right? If they're like, I love you as a creator, I'll fund you. But these are minorities, and another reason that gated content can be really tough is people tend to be monogamous with their gated content, right? So if you pay for a business newsletter, let's say, you probably aren't paying for 5, but you're willing to read 20 different newsletters that are free. And so again, just keep that in mind, and I think we can all learn something from Hello Kitty, hopefully, as that was the digit. All right, I'll speed through some of these other ones, but the third digit is that, if you haven't noticed, you probably have, tons of companies are jumping into this space because they do see that it's changing and there are a lot of opportunities within it. And so tons of companies like Spotify, TikTok, HubSpot, where I just was, Facebook, have announced multi-million or multi-billion-dollar investments in creators through their funds. And you can see here what that looks like. A lot of money. A lot of money is being pushed into this space. There's tons of reasons for this. I mean, one of them is just that a lot of their other distribution channels like Facebook aren't performing as well anymore. But it's exciting, right? And you can take advantage of this if you're a creator. One very simple way to take advantage of this, if you're a creator and you aren't against working full-time. I've been doing this for 5 years, working full-time and creating on the side, and I love it. Tons of companies are hiring for people in these roles, right? So head of creator platforms or creator data analysts, Amazon, Stripe, YouTube, you're seeing tons of big companies investing in this space. And so you could either work for them, but you could also go contract with them and support the creators in this ecosystem. I know a lot of us want to be the creator on the stage or the creator that everyone follows, but this is also an exciting space to support as well if you're not that. And you can see here the creator job listings over time. This only went to 2021. This was a study by ThinkNum, and they're going up exponentially. Who knows how the market downturn will impact this, but you can see this is a space worth watching. And I think what's important here, if you do work at a company, because I know there's some people who work at companies who are investing in creators, this relates to digit number 2, which is you need to know what the hell you're investing in creators for. That might sound obvious, but tons of companies are investing in creators and they don't actually know why or what they're trying to convert those people to do. So the best example that I can give is the companies that we're basically working with creators in order to sell content. So we've already talked about how that can be ineffective. You can see 2 examples of that, Quibi and CNN+. Now there's tons of reasons why maybe these companies didn't succeed, but what these 2 in particular did is that they said, we're gonna work with a bunch of creators, people like Ariana Grande, Reese Witherspoon, and they said, you know what, just driving that awareness, like we're gonna figure out the business model later. Didn't work, right? We all saw how those 2 went. And so if you are a company that's like, we need to get distribution, we need to have creators on board, well, you should think about what you're truly trying to convert that awareness to. In some cases, it might be your software in the back end. It may be that you're selling a new product that you orient around creators. I don't know, but I see too many companies these days jump onto this creator economy bandwagon, but truly have no idea what they're trying to do with this new awareness. So just keep that in mind. All right, so clearly it's exciting that we have a ton of people participating, we have a ton of companies participating in this new ecosystem, and often a lot of people jump to this idea that, okay, well now it's too saturated, as if there was one point in time that saturation happens. And so here are some data points that may sound like, yeah, wow, things are saturated. Every minute, 5.7 million Google searches, and again, some of this is definitely outdated. 5.7 million Google searches are conducted. 694,000 hours of YouTube are streamed. And so this is every minute. So tons of content is being created. But again, as I mentioned earlier, you can look at that and say, oh, wow, there's too much supply. But you can also say, wow, there's a lot of demand out there. And so I guess just raise your hand for this one. Who here feels like they should start a TikTok? Maybe like 30, 50%. I ask this because in this sphere where there's so much going on, so many people participating, it can often feel like you're being tugged instead of making an active decision in where you should participate. Everyone feels like they should create a TikTok because for some reason it seems less saturated. It's newer, right? So obviously I can succeed there and not, with a blog that's existed for 3 decades. Well, what I want to emphasize here is the importance of aligning your skill set and your goals with the channel that you choose. Because you can see in this sphere here, or this circle, there are so many platforms that you can participate in, and I guarantee no one in this room is on every single one. And you can see that all of them have ample supply and demand, right? You can't tell me that TikTok's not competitive. You can tell me that maybe it's been around for less time, but what's important here to note is that on every channel, whether it's TikTok or Twitter or even blogs that have been around, again, for decades, is that a new star is born every single day, right? So just because you think there's a lot of people participating, that does not relate to your ability to participate. I'll go over how you need to differentiate in a minute, but that does not mean you can't participate, but you do need to decide yourself which one aligns with my skill set and my goals, instead of just following the latest trends like I should create a TikTok. To reinforce this, you can see here that these are not the channels, but these are the types of media, and there's many more that you can create. There's endless types of content that you can create, right? So magazines, books, infographics, etc. And you can be successful potentially at all of them. You're probably going to have some that you are better at, but the medium only gets you so far, right? So content itself, there's some Google definitions here. The thing that I like to define content as just a way to translate ideas. I have an idea in my brain, and I want to drop it into your brain, or 10,000 brains, or 10 million brains. And I can do that with a Clubhouse chat, I can do that with a tweet, I can do that with a movie, I can do that in many different ways. And ultimately, the medium you choose won't matter, and you can reinforce this, and that's why I have this thing on the right-hand side, with the idea that many things get repurposed, right? That's why you see books become movies, or emails become podcasts, or tweets become videos. It's because they're all just different ways of taking the idea in one person's brain and dropping it into another brain. And so if that's true, if the medium really doesn't matter as much, how do you decide, right? If all of them can be effective. And I want to illuminate this concept by asking a couple more questions. Again, you don't need to answer this out loud, but just think to yourself, how many podcasts do you listen to? You just pick a number in your head. All right. The second question is, how many newsletters do you read? Let's say in a given year. How many people send you a newsletter that you're subscribed to? And the third question is, how many blogs have you read this year? So it doesn't have to be you're actively reading every article of theirs, but How many blogs have you randomly stumbled upon and read an article from? And the reason I'm asking this is because the way I view these different channels is, again, the alignment to what I can do, but also the way people engage with them. So there's no right or wrong here, but I think of podcasts as your best friends. And I say that because most people listen to an average of 6 or so podcasts. And when you listen to a podcast episode, you spend an hour with it, right? Or something around that span. You're listening every week, you feel like you know the hosts. But if you think of newsletters, I think of those as like your colleagues, your coworkers. You spend some time with them, there's a consistent thread, you come back for them, but they're not your best friends, right? And you know, you like them, but you have a wide assortment of them. And then blogs are even further along that spectrum. If you think about it, they're like, you know, the type of person you meet at a conference. You might see them once, you might never see them again, right? And you engage with tons of those people, right? You just get sent an article, you don't know who wrote it. You don't care who wrote it, really. You just care about the content. And so if you think about it like that, each medium actually serves a different purpose for creators. And that relates to your goals. So as an example, if you think about what you're trying to accomplish, here are a bunch of examples of what you might be trying to accomplish with your content. You might be just trying to have fun. But in some cases, you're like, no, I need MRR right now. In other cases, you're like, oh, I want to be seen as an expert in my respective space. Whatever it is, you need to cross-reference that with the different types of channels out there. If you are trying to increase your MRR immediately, do not start a podcast. You're not going to generate much revenue from your podcast immediately. Similarly, if you are trying to be an expert in a space, well, a blog might be kind of hard to do that because people don't come back to you all the time, right? They read one of your articles and then they leave. And so you want to think about what your primary goal is at this stage in your career or your stage in your creator journey. Write that down and then figure out which channels are actually best for me to invest in. Because as we talked about, there's all those channels, and you need to figure out which one actually aligns to what you're trying to accomplish. All right, so number 5, we've already talked about saturation. Now, if that's true, you need to figure out how to differentiate. The digit here is that there are nearly 2 billion websites out there. And if anyone needs a refresher, there's only around 7 billion people on Earth, so there's a lot of websites out there. You can see this. This was something I screenshotted earlier. That's just the counter going up every second. It's much higher today because this was, again, a couple hours ago. So there's a lot out there. You've probably heard me say this several times in this talk, but what I want to talk about is this idea of saturation. I've already touched on it, but saturation is not the sheer number of people in a space. It's not that number that I just showed you, the 2 billion websites. It's the likelihood that you can out-innovate, and this does not just apply to content, it applies to startups or any kind of industry that's competitive. And I want to talk about 2 different things, which you can see on the slides behind me. So I'll talk about the first 2 circles first. What you care about is your ability to out-innovate. And so if you imagine each of those bigger circles as industries, and the little circles are participants in the industry, the color of each circle indicates how well someone is doing at serving the customers in that space, okay? So if most people were to look at the left-hand side, they would prefer to actually go into the right circle because they say, well, there's a lot of people on the left. I don't want to enter that industry. There's a hell of a lot of people actively competing. I'm going to go to the right because no one's there. But if we keep those circles in mind, the color of them, you can see that the 3 on the right are doing really well at serving their customers or the people in that space. And on the left, they're not, right? I don't see any greens in there. So there might be a lot of people participating, but there's no one who's really killing it. And so that actually is a better market to participate in than the right-hand side. And I give 2 examples, Costco and Stripe, because those are 2 examples of companies that entered really, really competitive markets, Costco General Retail and Stripe FinTech, and they killed it because they found an angle that was better than the incumbents. The bottom half of the slide is obvious, but what a lot of creators miss is you have to figure out something or you have to operate in a space that people care about. Again, sounds obvious, but if people were to look at 2 circles, if one's completely empty, it's possible that you're the first person in the world to discover that people want this, but it's very unlikely. And so in these 2 comparisons, I would rather participate on the left-hand side of both of these examples, even though they look more saturated, if you were to use saturated as a term for just the number of people in a space. Here are a bunch of examples to make it tangible. And I split them into two different aspects, so how and what. Now, what do I mean by this? You can differentiate in many ways, but I've seen within content 2 key ways that people differentiate. One is how they produce their content, and the other is actually what they're talking about. Now, a lot of creators, if they think they're entering a saturated space, they will look for the what. They'll be like, what is no one talking about? Again, it's really hard to identify that, and often it means that people don't care about it, right? Supply and demand are intrinsically related. The other way that you can compete is how you do it. So these are 4 examples of people who operate, or I guess groups of people, who operate in the business sphere, okay? Business is so saturated if you were to just look at how many creators are in it, but these are 4 different media properties or content properties that have emerged in, I'd say, the last couple years that have done extremely well because of how they operate. So Charter, all they did was they took business insights or daily business news and they just made them visual. Cody Sanchez has contrarian thinking. She just made her insights contrarian. That attracted a group of people. Kyla Scanlon, if you've heard of her, she just creates these really funny, quirky videos, and so you could say she's funny. She's enjoyable to watch. The All In podcast, if you've listened to that, again, business news, but they found a way to make it exclusive. You feel like you're hearing a conversation that you wouldn't hear otherwise. And so it's not what they're talking about. They had a method that identified how they talk about it differently, if that makes sense. And now on the right-hand side, I have a bunch of what. So you can actually find areas that no one's operating and be, I guess, in the niches. But as I said, this is really hard to do. So just to give some fun examples, all of these are YouTube channels. There's someone named the Toe Bro. He's like a toe doctor. There's a lock-picking lawyer. He literally shows people how to pick locks. And you can see the number of views they get per month, and this is also outdated. I pulled this maybe 6 months ago. The Hoof GP is literally someone who treats a horse's hoofs. That's cool. I've never done that, so I couldn't operate in that space. But there are examples, and the final one is this one channel that I do watch. It's really fun. It's called Jenny's Mini Cooking Show, and it's just you've probably seen them before. It's like tiny kitchens that are this big, and they cook true meals with them and then have mice eat them. So in any case, what I want you to take away from this particular digit is that you have to be better, but the term better can be applied in many different ways. And a lot of people jump to, I must be better by finding something, again, really, really unique. No, you can be better by being funnier, being more contrarian, being opinionated, being more visual. And if you can't identify what this form of better is, how you're actually operating more effectively, then you probably aren't better, to be honest. And in addition to that, this is really key for distribution, because if you think about how you communicate about content to other people, if I go and tell you, hey, there's this really great podcast, I never say, hey, there's this really great podcast because it talks about technology, because you'd be like, every podcast talks about technology, or whatever space you're talking about. Instead, I'd be like, these guys are hilarious, or I really, really like how when I read Charter, I only have to spend 30 seconds because I can just scroll through and see the visuals, right? So it's how they're doing it differently, and that's also how you communicate and share what's great. So this is an exercise not to do now, but when you go home. As I mentioned, if you can't identify this for your respective space, how you're doing things differently, then you're probably not doing things differently. And so what I encourage you to do is write down, not about yourself, but first go through your inbox, go through your podcast subscriptions, whatever content you consume, and take your favorites, write them down, and then write down a simple sentence as to why you like it. The same way that you tell a friend about it. Hey, I really like this podcast because, and then take that and try to parse it into an adjective. So again, it could be contrarian, low stress, something that you like about it. And do that because one of the most important things about becoming a great content creator is understanding what makes great content. And so you need to recognize that in other content before you start to even understand how you can differentiate yourself. And then of course do this exercise on your own content after, and see if you can identify something, or ask a friend to do the same. You can also, you see some red at the bottom, you can do the same with things you don't like. What don't you like about it? What was that newsletter that you used to like and now you've unsubscribed from? Did it become too political? Did it become too long, too low quality? Identify what you didn't like about them, because I guarantee it's not the what, it's the how. Okay, number 6. The other thing that's really important if you're going to stand out is not just differentiating, but it's also the marketing, right? And so here's a data point from Ahrefs, which is that around 90% of content gets no traffic from Google. Maybe that's not surprising, but it's a lot of content out there, and Google is the biggest search engine in the world. And so here's another question to just ask yourself, write it down, be honest, you don't have to share it in the room, but if you were to think about all of the time that you spend as a content creator, how much of that time is spent on marketing as a percentage? When I've asked this question before, a lot of creators come back to me and say, maybe like 10%, maybe 1%, maybe 0. Some creators spend more time on marketing, but it is very, very common that people spend very little time on marketing. And I like to say that most creators operate too far at either end. So if you have all marketing, I call that shit, because you're literally selling terrible products because you've spent all your time selling something instead of creating something wonderful to sell, right? And so we've all met those. Those are the shillers or people that you don't want to hear from because you know their stuff isn't good. You know they've mastered the marketing but not the product. But a lot of creators, especially creators that tend to come to conferences like this that are really, really interested in how do I become a successful creator, they've spent all their time on the other end of the spectrum. They've mastered creating something wonderful, but they have no idea how to get it in front of people. And they don't spend any time doing that. And as extreme as this sounds, I tell people, based on my own experience, that it should be 50-50. Now, there's no perfect ratio, but that gives you an idea of the extent that you should be spending on marketing, right? It's of your time, your energy, your thought. Because if not, how are people going to hear about this? As an example, most people will spend hours, if not days, writing an article, and then they will spend 2 minutes posting about it on Twitter, and then they will never touch it again. So that's not even 1%, that's 0.0001% of the respective time. So it gives you a sense of like, okay, if I create an article, what's my checklist for sharing it? How many different properties am I putting it out on? What am I thinking about marketing when it comes to my whole stack of creations, right? And so that's really important. And I have an example from someone in the room. He's sitting in the front row. It's actually my fiance, Calvin. I said friend in this tweet, not to get people too distracted. But he writes a newsletter. You can go to it, calvinrosser.com. But he wrote a newsletter, I think now 4 years maybe. Great newsletter. But his audience was not very big for a while. And he would come to me, and I focus a lot on marketing, so my audience has grown a lot. And we've started thinking about, why hasn't his audience grown? And I realized something very simple, which is that he only ever sends his email to his email subscribers, which, again, not rocket science, but I convinced him that he should start investing in marketing, and he repurposed one of his emails, one that was already written, the product was already there, into a Twitter thread, and the first thread he wrote got 7,000 likes. So it shows you the content was already good, but there was no one there to hear it. Even the best work needs distribution. This is what you can see as I was just talking about. It was the same content, the exact same content. Of course, there was a little bit of repurposing that had to happen, but it reached thousands of people instead of who was on his email list. And something that I think is really important is you see a bunch of creators that you're familiar with. I guarantee they're not the best creators out there if we're talking about just the product that they're creating. I include myself in that. I see people all the time who have no audiences that are so incredibly impressive, but guess what? They spend 0 time on marketing. And so all of the best creators that you see on Twitter or have podcasts or something of the like are incredible marketers. I guarantee that if they've made it to where they are. And so 2 examples of people who are good marketers are David Prell and Peter Levels. This is not in any way meant to say they're not great at product too. But it is to say they're great marketers, and there's simple things you can do. So David Prell, I literally picked this up yesterday. He created a podcast studio. 99% of people who create podcast studios tell no one. He tweeted about it. These are really simple things. Peter is an incredible marketer because he finds ways to make the uninteresting interesting. So instead of him going and paying a bunch of money for Twitter ads, he decided, I'm going to do a giveaway. But what made it remarkable is you see tons of companies doing giveaways. You don't really see individuals saying, I'm going to give up $3,000 of my own money to buy someone a MacBook. That made it remarkable, and he's done tons of things like this. And these are really simple examples of marketing that a lot of people in this room, I guarantee, have not done. A lot of people will come to me and be like, okay, that's great. I don't really want to market myself, Well, one of the easiest ways you can market yourself without actually feeling too obtrusive is just to share what you're doing. So building in the open is probably a term that many people have heard of. That's what I did to initially grow my audience. So when I first started, as I mentioned, I was coding and launching things on Product Hunt, and I shared everything I was doing. So that included, these were 3 different products that I was working on. It included sharing my roadmap. A lot of people are like, oh, if I share my roadmap and someone's gonna copy it, who cares? Another one was literally streaming on Twitch for a competition, even though I was a terrible coder at the time, so that people could come and watch me and get behind what I was building. Another one was this product called FeeMake, where I wanted to know the distribution of women on Product Hunt, and I just shared that. I said, hey, who else wants to know that? And then I also shared, as I was building it, what packages am I using? How did I build it? Open sourcing the code. So you can very easily market yourself if you just share what you're trying to accomplish and how you're getting there, because you're either going to inspire people who also want to get there with you, or you're going to attract people who know how to get you there more quickly. Just a quick note on this, I found that this was so useful building in the open that I created an open page. So again, this is something that some companies do. I think ConvertKit either has one or had one where they share their revenue in the open. I created one for myself, which included my MRR, but it also included things like how many books I was reading that year, what my goals were, if I exercised that day. People loved it so much that this still is one of the things that I get emailed about the most when people discover it. And you can go to it at stephsmith.io/open if you're curious. But there are many ways to market yourself is really what I'm trying to get at. And so I would encourage people to do that. And I would encourage you to do that by just taking a second, either now or later, to think about just what are all the things that I'm already doing that I can just share openly, that I can just open source to the world, and again, attract some of those people who might find it interesting. Okay. Number 7 is another thing that I don't see enough creators do, which I do think in this very competitive space is important, is experimentation. And so there's the digit here I actually think is really important, which is that companies like Microsoft and Amazon, a lot of these very familiar names, they run over 10,000 controlled experiments each year within their companies. Why is this important? Well, these companies have grown for many reasons. I'm not trying to oversimplify, but if you think about one of the most powerful facets of technology, it's your ability to divide the present. This is what I mean. If you walk into a store, that storefront has one sign. They have one store layout. They have one cash register. They have one price point. They, because they are physical, can only operate with one reality. These tech companies have a different option. They can invent as many realities as they can, as long as they have enough traffic to test those different realities and figure out what is most effective. And this is something that not enough creators leverage, because we operate online. So we're like Microsoft and Amazon in this sense. We don't have to have one storefront. We don't have to have one price point. And so you can experiment. And one example of myself doing this was when I launched my book. I tweeted something originally just saying, hey, thinking of writing this book, would anyone buy it? And there was a bunch of people who said yes. But there was a few people who said, actually, yes, but because I originally said in the tweet it would be $10. They're like, yes, but you should charge more. I would pay $30 or $50, or some just said charge more. And I was like, that's cool, but what the hell do I charge? I have no idea. This is the first time I ever sold something backed from my audience. And what I ended up doing, because I worked in growth marketing, is I said, well, actually, why don't I just figure this out? Why don't I actually get the data that I'm lacking? And so what I did is I set up tiered pricing. And I didn't need to have some fancy engineer set up the back end and make this work. I just did it myself. And no, was it a perfect A/B test or anything? Definitely not. But what I did is in Gumroad, I just said, hey, it's going to start at $10. Every 30 copies, it's going to go up $5 until, because I can see the data in the back end, the conversion rate dropped significantly. And that's all I did. Again, not a perfect A/B test, but it was an interesting enough experiment that you can see Austin Reef, he's one of the co-founders of Morning Brew, but tons of other people talk about this just because they saw someone experimenting live, and they saw someone discover something that they hadn't thought of, even though it was right in front of them. Another simple example of testing something new, really, really simple. All I did when I sold this book was I added the live number of copies sold. And again, simple, but also relates to building in the open. You show people exactly how well you're doing or how well you're not doing. And that was picked up by so many creators that Gumroad actually just implemented it as a feature in their product. So you never know where those tests will end up, because some of them will succeed. And you also don't know how much awareness it can drive. So I mentioned Peter before, but he does all of these stunts. I think he's actually probably one of the best online at experimenting. And instead of buying ads again with his money, he decided to go buy a billboard that targeted Apple employees. And he even shared, you can see he's very good at sharing very transparently what he's doing. He shared even the price, the platform where he bought the ad, and it worked. And you can see, oh, I don't know if you can see it, but this particular tweet had 9,000 likes, and I think that alone probably paid for the billboard. I mentioned this before, but the amazing part of where we are today in 2022 is that you can actually experiment based on your level of conviction. So instead of just going and writing your book, why haven't you written a tweet first, or launched a podcast, or talked about it on some other podcast, or written a newsletter first? And you can do this progressively, right? Some things are easier than others. So if you can write a tweet first. If it's good, then you go record a podcast episode. If it's good, then go write a newsletter. If it's good, write your book. If it's good, go find a movie producer. But don't go and do something that you haven't validated at all. In the past, you had to do that. Today, you have the luxury of not having to. And the other thing is that, I mentioned this before, you have access to so many channels. So I've mentioned Twitter a lot because that's where I tend to operate, but there are endless other channels that you can test on. You can post on Reddit, you can post on Hacker News. These also skew tech because that's what I know, but there are tons of other platforms, forums, etc., that allow you to test your ideas and experiment and find out information that you can leverage, like saying, hey, I'm thinking of selling this book, what do you guys think? What should I price it at? Or just finding out the data yourself in the example I gave. All right, so the other important thing is time in making. This was actually referenced over here, and it's really important because most people just don't stick around long enough for it to work out. So I think this is a familiar data point probably to some, but it's an important one, which is that 90% of podcasts don't get past episode 3. That's really early, and so if you can imagine that's 90%, you can imagine the same exponential curve for 10 episodes, 30 episodes. I don't know the exact number, but I'm sure it's probably like 99.9% of people don't get past episode 100. I'm sharing my work here again just to show the importance of sticking around. I often, very, very often, have people ask me a question along the lines of, how did you build your audience? And they ask it as if I could tell them within a couple sentences, which would be impossible. And one time this happened recently, and I just decided to just like be direct with the person. And I was like, well, honestly, I taught myself to code, then I coded 6 projects, then I launched a book, I worked at these places, I launched a creator program, I have a podcast, I have a course, and I just went on and on and on. And I did that because I think a lot of people do have overnight successes, but one of your best assets is your ability or determination to stick in the game. That doesn't mean you have to do the same thing for 10 years. It doesn't mean you have to, just because you started a podcast, forever do a podcast. But it does mean that you have to continue creating, because these things are exponential by nature. Just think about the data points that even fuel the algorithms that we play in. If you think about your ability to rank on Google, one of the key data points there is your domain authority that builds over time as you get trustworthiness. Right? And so these things are exponential even at their core. And so if you've only stuck around for a couple weeks, a month, even a year, that doesn't give you nearly enough time to build up your credibility with the computers or the people that recognize you. This is basically what I said before, but just you can see this also was represented in the money I got from the platforms. There was years where I was making no money as a creator, and you can see it started to be exponential, and that came through the book. So that also relates to the idea that you don't know what will be successful. I never thought the book, of all things that I created, would be, the thing of the many that I created. And then on the right-hand side, those are my Twitter followers over time, and you can see, same curve. This is a fun little graphic that I did not make, but I hope it drives home the point that you might be a lot closer than you think. Of course, I don't want people who are creating that feel like they have no wins or that there's no traction to just keep going. The point is getting enough data and sticking around long enough and experimenting enough during that time period that you can find something that sticks. All right, and number 9 is something that I want to do a super quick live demo with. Sam touched on some of this stuff yesterday, but a lot of this data exists. So it's not like, again, you're a creator back in the 90s and you're like, I think people like this because 5 of my friends like this, and you're really playing with such little information. Today, you have access to so much information on the web, and just one digit that relates to that is that Reddit has over 1 billion monthly visits, but the more compelling data point is that they have over 3 million subreddits. Every single one of those subreddits is a data point that you can play into, and then each one of those has more data points that matter as well. So, as I mentioned, there's no need to reinvent the wheel, but you do need to use data to separate signal from noise. So in the book, extras, I have this long laundry list of tools that you can use to leverage or access this data that, again, is open on the web, that tells you what people care about. The simplest one is any keyword tool, because what is SEO? Of course, it's like this boring thing that some people dislike because it's black hat at times, but it's also all of the data points around what everyone on the web is looking for. When you enter a query, you're saying, hey, Google, I want this, and all of the keyword data that exists on many of these platforms like Ahrefs or Keywords Everywhere, that is information that you can leverage, not just for SEO, but understanding what people want or don't want. But another one that I love, or another 2, have to do with Reddit. So I'm going to do a quick demo, and it has to do with this tool. So you guys can still see this, yes. So this is a tool. I actually don't know the creator of it because they just have a GitHub profile. But this is a really cool tool where you can basically see the relational nature between different subreddits. And so if you, for example, I just entered digital nomad here. If you are like, hey, I've been a nomad for a while, I want to know what other nomads care about. I'm going to show you super quickly a few different ways that you can get that information. So one, you just enter it into this tool, digital nomad. You can see exactly over here how many subscribers, 1.6 million, how many are online. Pretty simple data that you can get from the Reddit app. But what I love about this tool in particular is that you can see what else they care about. So you can see here all of the related subreddits, and you can see the magnitude of the relationship. So for example, there's a few that are directly related to digital nomad here. As you can get a sense, there's kind of like a pod over here where clearly people care about fat fire, lean fire, how they're spending their money, how they're managing to do that while they're traveling. You can see there's kind of like earth porn outdoors. There's a cohort of nomads who really care about going and hiking and things like that. You can see there's a cohort of people who care, or are van dwellers, or who have rented a van. Maybe they're camping and things like that. Van life seems to be some interesting Thailand, pod here. But obviously that is one of the most significant concentrations of nomads out there. And then you can also see, maybe not surprisingly, they care about entrepreneurship, freelance. There's a lot of freelancers. And the things that I mentioned are like the high-level things, but you can see there's a ton of other subreddits here that give you a lot of information. And I've played around with this tool a lot, and I've always been surprised, even about spaces that I thought I knew a lot about. But this is just the first half. So once you pick a subreddit, then you would go into subreddit stats, which is another tool. I can blow this up. And I've already put it in here, but this is where you can go even deeper, and you can see some of the data I already talked about, but the top submissions, but also you can filter that by all time, this week, etc. And you can just get a sense of like what people are looking for. So if I go to year, I don't know what this one's about, but it's like, anyone else starting to notice this? If I'm writing about digital nomads, I'm clicking that and finding out like what is this thing that all of a sudden people are noticing? Because again, this is filtered by the top submissions. The one country you should not move to, like, that sounds interesting. So you can use this, you can see how many subscribers it has, how it's grown over time, and this is just one example of the endless tools online that aggregate information for you and make your job way easier. Instead of you trying to guess what people want, the data is out there as to what they truly want. One other tool that I would encourage people to play around with is SimilarWeb, which probably people are familiar with, but you can just enter any website into SimilarWeb, and the one, as a growth marketer, there's many valuable facets of this tool, but this is the one that is super simple. It's in their free version. And you enter any site into here, and you can see all of the, or at least the top 10 related sites, how much traffic they're getting. And this is really interesting because you can find out all types of things. Like I entered Nomad List into here earlier, and I just saw like some random Turkish travel agency that had a bunch of traffic, and I was like, what's that? And so if you just have a curious eye as you're exploring these things, you will discover things that you never would have thought of, because your set of experiences is much more limited than what exists online. One quick thing that I wanted to note on this idea of noticing things, this is an article I wrote 2019 maybe, before the pandemic, when I was nomadic and much of the world wasn't. And if you go to the search volume for digital nomad now, it's hard to see anything because obviously it spiked after the pandemic. But at that time, if you're paying attention, you notice things. And this is one thing I noticed when I was looking at this. So obviously, up and to the right, people care about this more. But if you looked really closely, you would notice that it always peaked in December. People apparently, this is me guessing based on the data, people apparently don't mind their job until the end of the year and they're making resolutions and then realize that they don't love their job anymore. And so that's just an example where like that itself could have been an article, right? All right, we're almost done here. So really the idea is, before you had to do user research like most companies still do, which is going and talking to one individual and figuring out what their problems are. Nothing wrong with that. You can get a lot more color that way. But this is such an incredible way to use the data that already exists online. And then the final thing that I touched on earlier when I talked about companies, but just because the creator economy is interesting doesn't mean you have to be a creator. You can also create tools for creators. As people say, you sell shovels during a gold rush. And so YouTube, as an example, is estimated to have added 394,000, I think that's the right number, full-time jobs or equivalent to the US in 2020. That's just the US. So these platforms generate so much interest, so much action within their relative economies that you can participate not necessarily by creating the content, but by creating tools for people in that sphere. And so an example, or actually a way to frame this is, if you look at the writing tools that have been launched throughout time, we're pretty, I don't like to use the term saturated, as I said before there, but we've got a lot of tools and they've existed for a long time, which is why it's much easier, or it was up until maybe the last couple years, to start a blog than it was to start a podcast. Podcasting, on the other hand, in 2012, that's when Apple made their podcast app standalone. That's 10 years ago. And since then, there's been this wave of audio tools, but there's still a lot missing. And so this is just a super simple way to show you that there's a lot missing in this one space. This is just an example. So if you think about how you find content, and then also when you're in an app, what features help you augment your experience there, audio is just not comparable at all to written content. So if we take the first example, how do you find written content? Well, you look in a search engine or on social media or word of mouth, right? Directories, ads, viral platforms like Hacker News or Reddit. If you think about the equivalent for audio, I have them highlighted here. Mostly people find audio through word of mouth. We are starting to see more ads because the attribution is getting better. And then sometimes on social, right, if you see someone else talking about it. But there's all of this other ecosystem that exists for written content that just does not exist for audio content. The other example is when you're in an app, if you think about how you're reading a particular blog piece as an example, there's opportunity to comment on your blog piece, to search something within the article, to save it later with something like a Pocket, to highlight it, to share it, to add a paywall to it. A lot of this also doesn't exist for audio, right? And so I've highlighted the ones that I think are more mature than others, but the idea here is that there is still so much opportunity to create for other creators and not just be the creator. So as a quick example, and something I want you to think about now or later, is just what gaps do you see in your problems that you're experiencing as a creator? And I'm shouting out Genius Link not because I'm affiliated with them, because I had this aha moment when I spoke to them the other day, as you've probably seen, they're a sponsor here. But we've had, as a podcast host, we've had so many difficulties figuring out where we should send traffic. Should we send to a landing page? Should we send to Apple Podcasts? If we do that, well, we're alienating a cohort of people. Should we be sending to a specific episode or a podcast overall? Should we have an email box that pops up? Well, you can't do that on Apple Podcasts. And so there's all of these different permutations of what we want to do depending on who someone is and where they're coming from. And Genius Link is a perfect example where that's what they do. It's kind of like a if statement that you can set up to say, oh, if they're coming from Apple, maybe I send to Apple Podcasts. If they're on desktop, maybe I send somewhere else. And so I didn't come up with this. They came up with this a long time ago. But that's an example where if I was a creator and I wanted to create a business for other creators, I would just think through, like, that is a clear problem that I've faced within my own sphere of creating, and I could fix that for a bunch of other people. All right, so those are the 10 digits, but I have 2 super quick, fun things that are more so, I worked on trends for a long time, so I love sharing just things that or some percentage of the people in this room might be like, whoa, I didn't know this existed. So the first is the influence of artificial intelligence. So the scale that we're moving in AI is so quick that you can see some information there that the number of parameters that are used to train these algorithms went from 175 million with GPT-3, which is what a lot of creators would recognize, to 1.75 trillion in one of the recent AI models coming out of China. So we're moving really quickly there, and it's not to scare people, but it is, as I mentioned in one of the earlier digits, you need to know the space you're operating in and be realistic about what's to come. And so the integration of technology within all of our creations is inevitable. It doesn't mean that robots are going to replace us as creators, but it's also exciting that potentially you can utilize some of this to your advantage. So I have some images up here, but the first one on the upper left, you've probably heard of DALL-E. Those are DALL-E-generated images. On the right-hand side, you can see when GPT-3 came out, there's a bunch of people who were like, oh, I got to the front page of Hacker News, and GPT-3 wrote it. The bottom are examples also from DALL-E from a friend of mine, and I thought these ones were really fun because a lot of the DALL-E images coming out are just like random things, like, oh, how can I get this in impressionist style? This was a friend who put on the left-hand side logos for co-working space in Thailand, I think it was. And this is what it generated. And I've spent a lot of time in Thailand, and I gotta say that I feel like some of these exist. And then the right-hand side was something similar. It was like, I don't know if it was I think it was co-working space in Canggu or in Bali. And again, I've spent a lot of time in Canggu, and these look very familiar. And so what I'm getting at here is that we should be excited about the integration of technology as it accelerates with our creative pursuits. And I think a lot of creators view it as a competitive thing. Like, we don't want articles that are AI-driven or AI-assisted to exist on Google, because that's not right. But in any case, I think it's quite exciting. And then the final thing, because I'm over time, I can see I have a big sign here that says, please wrap up. And then the final thing is digital influencers, which are similar, this integration of technology and the creator economy that we live in. So there's this band, maybe you've heard of it, called Strawberry Prince, with billions of YouTube views, billions. This is Strawberry Prince. So you might not recognize it. I've never heard of them until I started diving into this space, but not so different to Hello Kitty, right? And we talk a lot about the involvement of technology. This is a great example where people think that people are only attracted to humans or things that are created by humans, and this is an example where that's not true. And these are 4 other examples of influencers that have a collective 10 million followers on Instagram. They also have a lot of followers on TikTok. None of them are real. They're all virtual influencers. And the interesting aspect of this trend, which again, a lot of people roll their eyes at, I even saw someone the other day when I shared this, they said, oh, so now social media is truly fake. It's fully fake. And I was like, well, that's one interpretation. Or you could say, this is exciting. You can fully curate some creator. And again, some people might say, that's terrible. Well, you could also say, well, I'm a terrible singer. Maybe I could be a great singer as my virtual influencer, right? All of the things that you don't like about yourself or that you don't even maybe want to share about yourself, you have the potential to change. And I think this is actually quite exciting. And the final slide this is an example of someone who did something similar. This is, the character is named Miko, and this is a woman who uses Unreal Engine in a $30,000 suit. to become this character as she streams on Twitch, and she has almost 1 million followers on Twitch. And again, I think it's very interesting because I think we're going to see a lot more of this, and maybe the first initial reaction that people have is that's weird, or like that shouldn't exist, we should only follow humans. But I think it's quite interesting and almost inevitable. So that's it. You can follow me or find me at those places.